They had found 17 dead civilizations before this one. Senior archaeologists had walked through the ruins of species that had burned themselves to ash in nuclear fire. She had the remains of peoples who had poisoned their own worlds, or who had simply faded away when their stars grew old. Each time, the story was the same. A species rose, built great things, and then fell. What they left behind told the what they had valued most. Weapons, treasure vaults, administrative centers, temples to gods who had failed to save them, resource extraction sites that showed how greedily they had consumed their worlds. These were the things that survived. These were the things species built to last. The humans should have been no different. Their world was the third planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. The survey probes had flagged it as a standard extinction site. A gamma ray burst from a nearby stellar collapse had sterilized the planet 8,000 years ago. The humans had been gone in an instant, caught in a cosmic accident they never saw coming. They had been a young species, barely beginning to explore their own solar system. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. Had expected the usual work, the ruins, extract any useful technology, document the species for the archives, move on to the next dead world. She had not expected the graves. The first site her team found was on a large landmass the humans had called Europe. The probes had flagged it as an unusual concentration of organized structures, so sent a ground team to investigate. She went with them because she was thorough, and because, after 40 years of this work, she had learned that the interesting discoveries never showed up on probe scans. The team landed on a gentle hillside covered in grass that had evolved in the 8,000 years since the humans died. The planet had healed itself, as planets do. New species had filled the gaps left by the old, but beneath the soil, the human structures remained. They were stones, thousands of them, white markers arranged in perfect rows that curved across the hillside like waves frozen in time. Each stone was the same size and shape as the others. Each one was placed exactly the same distance from its neighbors. The precision was remarkable. Ordered a scan, and the results made her pause. There were bodies beneath the stones, one body for each marker. Analysis of the remains showed that these humans had all died within a 4-year period, and their injuries suggested violence. A war, then. They had seen war graves before on other worlds. Mass pits where the dead were thrown together, enemy and ally alike, their identities lost in the scale of the slaughter. Disposal sites for the biological waste that war produced. This was not that. Each of these bodies had been placed in its own separate hole. Each had been positioned carefully with respect, and each stone marker bore carved symbols that the translation software quickly decoded. Names, dates of birth, dates of death, sometimes a few words that translated to things like beloved son, or he gave all, or forever in our hearts. Walked among the stones while her team took samples and readings. The scale of it was difficult to process. Her scanner told her there were 67,843 individual graves in this one site, 67,843 holes dug into the earth, 67,843 bodies wrapped and lowered down with care, 67,843 stones carved with names and dates. The effort required was enormous. The resources spent on this single site could have built defensive structures or production facilities. Instead, the humans had used them to bury their dead one by one, marking each with their name so they would not be forgotten. It made no sense to. She ordered her team to expand the search. What they found made even less sense. The burial sites were everywhere, every continent, every climate zone, concentrated in and around population centers but also scattered across empty lands where only a few humans had ever lived. Some were large, like the hillside of white stones. Others were small, just a few markers behind family dwellings or in small plots at the edges of towns. But they were all the same in one way. Each grave was individual. Each grave was marked. Each grave said that the person buried there had been someone who mattered. Junior researcher found a site on another continent that confused the team even further. It was a city that had once been called Washington, and in its center was a long wall of black stone. The wall was covered in carved names, more than 58,000 of them, all humans who had died in a war fought far from this place. There were no bodies beneath this wall. It was not a burial site at all. It was a memorial, a place where the living came to remember the dead. Scans showed that humans had visited this wall constantly. The ground in front of it was worn smooth by countless feet, and there were traces of offerings left behind. Flowers, which had rotted away but left chemical signatures. Small objects placed at the base of the wall. Letters, their paper gone but their shapes preserved in the compressed soil. The humans had come here to grieve for people they had never known. Strangers visiting to mourn strangers, connected only by the fact that both were human. Did not understand. She had studied 17 dead civilizations. She had seen how species treated their dead. They themselves recycled their bodies when they died, returning their components to useful function. It was efficient. It honored the dead by ensuring they continued to contribute to the collective. Other species burned their dead, or consumed them, or launched them into space. Some believed in afterlives and buried their dead with goods to help them in the next world. But the humans did not seem to believe their dead needed help. The grave goods they left were tokens, not tools. Flowers and letters and small objects that held meaning only to the living. The humans were not burying their dead to help the dead. They were burying them to help themselves. To remember stood on the hillside in Europe as the sun set over a world that had healed itself without its humans. The white stones glowed in the fading light, row after row after row, each one a marker for a person who had lived and died and been deemed worthy of remembrance by their people. They had always measured civilizations by what they built for the living, their cities, their technologies, their weapons, their monuments to power and achievement. These were the things that showed what a species valued. These were the things that proved a species had mattered. But the humans had built something different. They had built monuments to their dead, not to kings or generals or great leaders, though they had those too. They had built monuments to ordinary people, soldiers and sailors and children and workers and all the countless unnamed lives that made up a species. They had refused to let any of them be forgotten. Looked at the stones and felt something she had not felt in 40 years of this work. She felt curious, not about the humans' technology or their resources or their military capabilities. She felt curious about who they had been. What kind of species looked at its dead and said, "Each of you mattered. Each of you will be remembered." She activated her communication link and sent a message to her team leaders. Expand the search parameters. I want every burial site on this planet mapped and every grave, every memorial, every marker. There was a pause before responded. Senior archaeologist, that will take months. There are millions of sites. I know, said, we have time. She looked at the white stones one more time before returning to her transport. Somewhere in the archives of the Science Directorate, there was a file on this planet that described it as unremarkable. A young species, barely spacefaring, with no unique innovations or valuable resources. Nothing special, nothing worth noting. Was beginning to think that file was wrong. The team spread across the planet over the following weeks, and what they found continued to surprise in ways she had not expected. On a different landmass, one the humans had called North America, the team discovered a vast cemetery outside a city named Arlington. The graves there numbered in the hundreds of thousands, stretching across green hills as far as sensors could reach. Like the site in Europe, each grave was marked with a white stone. Each stone bore a name and dates, but there was something different about this place. The bodies buried here had served in the human military across many different wars, spanning centuries of their history. Some had died in battle. Others had survived their wars and died later of old age. But all of them had been brought here to rest together, generation after generation, united not by how they died but by the fact that they had served. Discovered something else. The humans had assigned guards to this cemetery, soldiers who marched in precise patterns before a specific grave, day and night, in all weather conditions, for decades without stopping. Analysis of the ground showed the footsteps had worn paths into the stone. The guards had changed, generation after generation, but the watch had never ended. The grave they guarded contained no name. The marker said only, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." The humans had posted guards over the grave of a person they could not even identify. Struggled to comprehend this. The resources required to maintain guards at a single grave for decades would have been substantial. Guards needed food, shelter, training, and replacement when they grew old or died. The humans had spent all of this on a person whose name they did not know, simply because that person had served and died and deserved to be remembered. But the discoveries grew stranger still. On another continent, in a region called Japan, the team found temples where humans had built monuments to children who had never been born. The translation software struggled with the concept at first, but eventually understood. These were pregnancies that had ended before birth. Bobbies who had never taken a breath, never opened their eyes, never existed as independent beings. The humans had mourned them anyway. Small statues stood in rows at these temples, each one representing a lost child. Humans had dressed the statues in tiny clothes and left offerings of toys and food. The chemical traces showed that many of these statues had been visited regularly for years, sometimes decades, parents returning again and again to mourn children who had never lived. Researcher who specialized in species psychology admitted she did not understand. These beings never existed, she said. They were potential, nothing more. Why would the humans spend resources on potential that was never realized? Had no answer, but the evidence was clear. The humans had valued these unborn children enough to build temples to them. They had grieved for lives that had never begun, possibilities that had been lost. The team found more puzzles as they explored. In the deep ocean, they found the wreck of a passenger ship called Titanic. The vessel had struck ice and sunk, killing over 1,500 humans. This was not unusual. Disasters happened on every world. What was unusual was that the humans had returned to this site decades later, after developing technology that could reach such depths. They had not come to salvage the valuable materials on the ship. They had come to place a memorial on a marker for the dead that no living human would ever see with their own eyes. A grave in the crushing darkness of the ocean, where only machines could visit. On mountains across the planet, the team found similar markers. Humans had died on these peaks attempting to climb them, not for resources or strategic advantage, but simply for the challenge of reaching the top. When they died, other humans climbed the same dangerous slopes to place memorials where they had fallen. One mountain called Everest was particularly revealing. The bodies of dead climbers had been left on its slopes because the danger of retrieving them was too great. But the humans had not abandoned these dead. They had named them, documented them, and transformed them into warnings and landmarks for future climbers. Even in death, the fallen continued to serve a purpose. Then made a discovery that changed everything thought she understood about the humans. In the same continent where the white stone hillside stood, she found a cemetery from a war fought long before the others. The translation software called it the World War, then corrected itself to World War I. The humans had apparently fought more than one war that spanned their entire globe. In this cemetery, the dead were not separated by which side they had fought for. The enemies lay side by side. Their graves were tended with equal care. Soldiers who had killed each other were buried together, their names carved with the same respect, their memories preserved with the same dedication. Stood among the stones and sent a visual feed back to. "Senior archaeologist," she said, her voice odd in a way had never heard from her before. The humans buried their enemies. Watched the feed in silence. The graves were identical. There was no way to tell from looking at them which soldiers had been allies and which had been enemies. The humans had decided that death erased those distinctions, that in the end, all the fallen were simply dead. They honored everyone who died, continued, not just their own, their enemies too. This was unprecedented in archaeological records. Every other species they had studied treated enemy dead with contempt, or at best, indifference. Mass graves, unmarked pits, bodies left to rot on battlefields. The dead enemy was garbage to be disposed of, not a person to be remembered. The humans had looked at their enemies and seen people. Reviewed all the data her team had collected. The graves of soldiers and children, the memorials in oceans and on mountains, the markers for the unknown and the unnamed, the centuries of dedication to remembering every person who had died. She realized that she had been thinking about this wrong from the beginning. The humans had not built these graves and memorials for the dead. The dead did not need stones or guards or offerings. The dead were gone, their consciousness ended, their atoms returning to the cycles of the universe. The living were the ones who needed these places. The graves were not about death, they were about connection. Every grave was a statement that said, this person was loved. This person mattered to someone. This person was part of our community, our family, our species. When they died, we did not throw them away like garbage. We placed them carefully in the ground, marked their resting place, and promised to remember them. The act of burial was the act of refusing to let go, of insisting that relationships did not end with death, of declaring that the bonds between people were stronger than the simple biological fact that hearts stopped beating and brains stopped thinking. Thought about the approach to death. When a died, their body was broken down into component materials and recycled into new production. It was efficient. It was logical. The dead continued to contribute to the collective by providing resources for the living. The humans would have found this horrifying. They did not want their dead to be useful. They wanted their dead to be remembered. They wanted to visit the places where their loved ones lay and speak to them, even knowing they could not hear. They wanted to bring flowers that would wilt and letters that would never be read, because the act of bringing them was itself meaningful. The humans had understood something they had never grasped. Grief was not a problem to be solved. It was a connection to be maintained. The pain of losing someone was proof that they had mattered, and the humans refused to let that pain fade. Looked at the data again. Millions of burial sites, billions of graves, an entire planet covered with markers saying someone died here and they mattered. She began to compose a preliminary report for the science directorate, but she found that she did not have the words to explain what she had found. The language had no term for what the humans had done. There was no category in the archaeological database for species that honored every single one of its dead. She would have to create a new category, and she would have to keep searching because she knew now that there was more to find. The humans had been so much more than the probe scan suggested, so much more than a young species, barely spacefaring, with no unique innovations. The humans had understood something profound about what it meant to be a person, and was determined to understand it too. The expedition had been on the human world for 3 months when finally submitted her report to the science directorate. She had reviewed all the data personally. She had visited sites on every continent. She had graves and memorials beyond counting, each one a small statement that said someone had lived and mattered and was remembered. The response from the directorate was what she expected, efficient and cold. Resources for extended study are not approved. The site shows no technological value. The remaining structures and prepare for departure to the next survey target. Read the message in her quarters on the research vessel, surrounded by data files and images from the human world below. She had known this was coming. The Science Directorate measured value in terms of resources extracted and technologies recovered. A civilization that had spent its wealth on remembering its dead rather than advancing its capabilities was not a civilization worth studying. But it spent 40 years following those measurements, and for the first time, she thought they might be wrong. She requested a meeting with the Directorate Council. It took 2 weeks for them to respond, and when they did, they seemed annoyed that she was wasting their time. She would have exactly 10 minutes to make her case. She spent those 2 weeks preparing, not by gathering more data about resources or technologies, but by thinking about what she had seen. The graves, the memorials, the guards marching in endless patterns before the tomb of an unknown soldier, the parents returning year after year to the temples of their unborn children, the enemies buried side by side, their hatred forgotten in death. When the meeting finally came, stood before the council and spoke plainly. The humans were not remarkable in the ways we usually measure. Their technology was primitive compared to ours. Their resources were not unusual. Their achievements in science and engineering were modest. By every standard they used to evaluate civilizations, they were ordinary. The council members watched her with impatient expressions. She was wasting their time, and they wanted her to know it. "But I believe we are using the wrong standards," she continued. "We measure civilizations by what they built for the living, their weapons, their cities, their monuments to power. We assume that these things show what a species valued most, and perhaps they do for most species, but not for the humans." She activated the display and showed them images of the hillside in Europe, the white stones glowing in the morning light, row after row after row, stretching across the green hills like frozen waves. The humans valued their dead, not because of what the dead could do for them, not because they believed in afterlives where the dead would reward the living. They valued their dead simply because the dead had been alive. They had been people. They had been loved. She showed them the memorial wall covered in names, the guards marching before the tomb of the unknown, the temples full of statues dressed in tiny clothes, the cemetery where enemies lay together in peace. The humans understood something that we have forgotten, or perhaps never knew. Every individual matters, not because of what they produce or achieve or contribute to the collective. They matter because they exist, because they are someone's child, someone's friend, someone's love, because they are woven into the fabric of relationships that make a society. The council members were silent now, could not tell if she was reaching them or if they were simply waiting for her to finish so they could dismiss her. When a human died, the survivors did not calculate their remaining value and dispose of them efficiently. They stopped. They grieved. They dug a hole in the ground and placed the body inside with care and love. They marked the spot so they could return. And they did return again and again, to remember and to grieve and to maintain the connection that death had interrupted but not destroyed. She paused, gathering her thoughts for the final argument. "I have studied 17 dead civilizations. I have seen what they left behind, weapons and treasure vaults and monuments to power. These things tell us that those species valued strength and wealth and dominance. They tell us nothing about whether those species were worth knowing, nothing about whether they understood what it meant to be a person, to love and be loved, to matter to someone." She showed them one final image, a small grave in a small plot behind a family dwelling, a single stone marker, worn by weather, bearing the name of a child who had died young. Chemical analysis showed that flowers had been placed at this grave every week for 30 years. Long after the parents who had lost the child must have died themselves, someone had continued bringing flowers. The humans did understand. Every single one of them mattered. Every death was a loss worth mourning. Every person was worth remembering. She deactivated the display and faced the council. "I am requesting that the human burial sites be preserved and protected in perpetuity, not for study, not for resources, but because the humans showed us something we need to learn. They showed us what it looks like when a species truly values its members, all of them, without exception. The council was silent for a long moment. Then the senior member spoke. What you are describing has no practical value. It does not advance our technology. It does not strengthen our position. It does not benefit the collective in any measurable way. I know, said. That is exactly the point. The humans did not bury their dead because it was practical. They did it because it was right, because their dead deserved to be remembered, because the living needed places to grieve and remember and maintain their connections to those they had lost. She took a breath. We have forgotten how to grieve. We dispose of our dead efficiently and move on. We measure their value in terms of what they produced and what they contributed, and we lose something precious in that measurement. We lose the understanding that every is more than their production. Every is loved by someone. Every matters. The senior council member's expression was unreadable. You are asking us to change our entire understanding of value. Yes, said I am. The council deliberated for 2 days. When the decision came, had already prepared herself for rejection. They were not a species that changed their understanding easily. They valued efficiency and logic and practicality. What she was proposing was none of those things. But the message surprised her. Protection approved. Human burial sites to be designated as Category 1 preservation. All vessels are prohibited from disturbing the sites. The Science Directorate will ensure the graves remain undisturbed in perpetuity. Read the message 3 times before she believed it. Then she read the attached note from the senior council member. I had a daughter once. She was recycled 40 years ago. I never knew where her materials went. I never had a place to remember her. I think I understand now what I lost. Stood at the viewport of her vessel and looked down at the human world. Somewhere on that planet, the white stones still stood in their perfect rows. The memorial walls still bore their carved names. The guards had stopped marching long ago, but the tomb of the unknown soldier remained, waiting for someone to remember. The humans were gone. Their hearts had stopped beating 8,000 years ago. Their minds had stopped thinking. Their voices had fallen silent. But they were not forgotten. They would never be forgotten now. They would make sure of that. Thought about all the species she had studied. The ones who had built weapons and the ones who had built treasure vaults. The ones who had conquered and the ones who had been conquered. All of them were gone now, their achievements crumbled to dust, their monuments fallen. But the humans had built something that lasted. They had built love into the ground itself. They had planted their grief in the soil and marked it with stones, and even now, 8,000 years later, that love remained. Anyone who walked among those graves could feel it. The connection between the living and the dead. The refusal to let go. The insistence that every person who had ever lived was worth remembering. The humans had understood what so many other species had missed. The measure of a civilization was not what it built for the living. It was what it preserved for the dead. Not because the dead needed it, but because the living needed to believe that they too would be remembered. That they too mattered. That when their hearts stopped beating, someone would stop and grieve and mark the spot where they lay. The humans had honored every fallen, every soldier and every child, every enemy and every friend, every named and unnamed person who had ever lived and died on their world. And now they would honor them in turn. Gave the order to begin the final survey. Every grave would be documented. Every memorial would be mapped. Every name that could be recovered would be recorded in the archives, preserved for as long as they existed. The humans had refused to let their dead be forgotten, and now, thanks to them, neither would the. On a quiet world orbiting a yellow star, the graves waited in patient silence. The stones had weathered and worn, but they still stood, row after row after row, each one a marker, each one a name, each one a statement that someone had lived and mattered and was loved. The humans were gone, but they were not forgotten. They would never be forgotten.